Thank you, Yaron, and thank you for the invitation. I feel as though I'm here under false pretenses in two respects, only one of which is not my fault. My colleague, as Yaron said, my colleague Celia Donert can't be here, and this poses something of a challenge since our research is complementary, but with a fairly strict division of labor. I'm a historian of modern Germany with an interest in German Sinti in the 20th century, focusing on the Nazi persecution. And Celia's research has been on Roma in socialist Czechoslovakia and more recently in international human rights movements. So neither of us is primarily a historian of migration, though we're both interested in the transnational movement of people and ideas. And the Romani populations we know best have been those native to the territories in which they lived. So I have to admit that it was overambitious of us to promise a paper on the uses of history about debates about migration. And what I want to do instead is tell you about a new project, invite your comments and thoughts as they arise from your own expert knowledge of particular cases, and also invite you to think with us about how, if at all, collective experiences of a now relatively distant past might help us to understand the contemporary situation of European Roma, one feature of which is voluntary migration. The project is an academic network funded by the British Arts and Humanities Research Council on the topic of the legacies of the Roma genocide in Europe since 1945. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the British funding regime, an academic network doesn't undertake original research. Rather, the funding facilitates a group of scholars to carry on structured conversations about a particular question or questions and to work towards devising a new research agenda or extending existing research. Our network involves scholars from and with expertise on the UK, the US, France, Italy, Austria, the Czech Republic, Poland, Romania, and the Nordic countries, from a range of disciplines. Our interlocutors also include Jana Horvatova, the director of the Roma Cultural Museum in Brno, see, I remembered that, and members of Roma communities in the UK and the Czech Republic. Our named institutional partners are the Migrom Project, what's left of it, as it were, hence our presence here, Roma Voices of Manchester, and the Romani Studies Department at the Charles University in Prague. We have had really very considerable support from Yaron and from Roma Voices in developing the network. And the project's due to begin early this year, although we'll probably have to postpone it given Celia's illness. So the starting point of our discussions is the observation that while there's still plenty of research to be done about the genocidal policies pursued by European states between the mid-1930s and 1945, there's a still larger gap in our knowledge about what happened after 1945 and the ways in which those policies have shaped the social, political, and cultural history of Roma and Sinti since 1945. We use the term genocide advisedly. In the conjuncture that produced fascist and radical nationalist dictatorships and the German War of Annihilation, ghettoization and internment, sterilization and slave labor, mass killing and letting die are appropriately understood in policy terms as points on a continuum and in human terms as components of a shared, if by no means uniform, experience of mortal threat to individual bodies and communities. Investigating the legacies of those events isn't simply a matter of filling a gap, though. Among other things, it's the question begged every time somebody says, as we said in our grant application, that the trauma of the mid-20th century genocide, as well as its contested recognition by majority societies, is paramount for understanding the persistent discrimination against European Roma today. That's a proposition, then, that requires interrogation and historical exploration. What indeed is there to be understood? Where are the continuities? Where are the breaks? Where are the innovations, the new directions? What is the history of how the vision of a Roma genocide itself has become established? how, where, when, and indeed how far have Roma communities themselves internalized that vision? Scholarship in the social sciences, which tackles questions such as migration, socioeconomic exclusion, and struggles for citizenship or human rights, frequently references wartime persecution in relation to contemporary forms of discrimination, but these connections often remain intuitive and haven't been systematically explored by historians. So the specific questions that form the starting point for our discussions are these. How have memories of discrimination and persecution been transmitted within Roma families? How can historians trace and narrate the legacies of the Roma genocide within families of first, second, and third generation survivors? To what extent can we compare the memories of persecution amongst Roma in different places and in different migration contexts? And here you can see that we do introduce the notion of migration experience, and our interest is in the ways articulations of the past may be shaped by needs and discursive or rhetorical tools that arise from living in a new place, perhaps alongside other minorities, raising historical claims. To what extent have continuities in discriminatory practices within local and national welfare agencies, police, health, and education authorities influenced memories of persecution among Roma communities and families? In the light of an emerging agenda of memorialization, how can we contribute to contextualizing policies and practices of commemoration and memorialization? How has the legacy of genocide shaped the political construction of Roma identities? And not least, what are the ethical and political dilemmas for historians who seek to explore these histories? Now, you'll recognize some echoes of the Migrom project here. We share Migrom's concern with the grounds and impacts of state policy on the one hand, the subjectivity and agency of Roma subjects on the other, and the interactions between the two. The two substantive workshops we plan to organize reflect those two interests. The first will focus on public policies and private memories. And in spite of the emphasis on memory that you'll have spotted in the research questions, we mean to find space to explore here how far the genocide experience has been reflected on by policy practitioners themselves in different national and local contexts. This reflection could historically be associated with the differential official acknowledgement of the genocide itself. So Ari Joskovits has recently argued against the continuity thesis, the argument for a continuity of discriminatory practice, in showing that in the immediate post-war period, the International Refugee Organization used Gypsy as a privileged category that improved an applicant's chances of getting support from that organization. Though not without some debate, and unpicking these debates is part of the research, and only for a brief period. The second workshop on the subjective experience of Roma focuses on families as bearers of experience and memory. As with Yaron's account of recent migration as a phenomenon of family networks, our emphasis here reflects an empirical observation. Genocidal policies targeted Romani families through forced sterilization that frustrated their physical and moral reproduction, and through internment practices that challenged and inverted the value systems rooted in intact family structures, as survivors of the family camp in Auschwitz attest. Here, my own hope, again, is that we can think of memory in the widest sense to include traces, or the ways in which bodies and families, as well as minds, were marked by violence and deprivation. For example, in the loss not only of living generations, but of generative power. And we can also think, if we think of the loss of life and the capacity to have a family, we might also be thinking of other now legally compensatable injuries, the loss of health, the loss of education, the loss of earning power, and their medium and long-term consequences for Roma and their families, both visible and invisible. To come back to our misleading title, what might this have to do with migration and debates about it? Well, I've already suggested one aspect, the question of how Roma, who move from one civil society to another, receive and or adapt to the narratives, if any, that each new hometown offers about their past. We ended yesterday by talking about integration, and I think that one use of the past that deserves a closer look is the way in which the history of genocide is deployed in discourses and practices of integration or inclusion. Thus, the facts of the Roma genocide have been officially acknowledged by many of the relevant states. In most places, Roma now count among the catalogue of other victims who feature in Holocaust education and commemoration. And the intended message of those majority ritual practices is one of rights and respect in an inclusive society. To be sure, this has usually been the result of pressure from Roma themselves. And this is a reminder that the genocide has provided a central internally integrating narrative for Roma at national and transnational level. This is most apparent in the German case, where a contest over control of the files of the Race Hygiene Institute, whose staff provided the rationale for internment, sterilization, and deportation, was the spur, or certainly a key early moment in Romani political organization. The prize in that contest was the recovery of some power over people's own family histories. And Germany also provides, I think, the largest canon of testimony to the persistence and functionality of private memory of trauma transmitted through families. So far, less successful mobilizations around the preservation of the gypsy camp at Lety in the Czech Republic raise a question whether conflicts over that past might be relevant to the choice between voice and exit that we'll hear more about this morning. We had a recent experience of a problematic melding of integrational impulses from above and from below when we were invited to contribute to the drafting of Deep Breath, Guidelines on the Steps Towards Achieving Official Recognition of Anti-Gypsyism and on Promoting Remembrance and the Teaching of Roma History in Schools, intended to be issued by the European Roma and Traveller Forum, which, as Yaron reminded us, has a privileged relationship with the Council of Europe. Among the, frankly, mythologizing and prescriptive elements of the earlier draft, which still include the recommendation that there should be an international agreement on what Roma should call the genocide, there was a strong and unreflected emphasis on Auschwitz as a central symbol and the family camp in Birkenau as the defining experience, which it was a task of educators to communicate. In view of the multidimensionality of the wartime experience of Roma and the heuristic and, we think, politico-moral importance of acknowledging that and other aspects of its uniqueness, that's to say the uniqueness of the genocide of the Roma, we did our best to modulate that approach in the final document. In short, in the 21st century, both those who claim to speak for Roma and those who speak for the majority societies are using references to that genocide history to discursively build what's tacitly at least envisioned as a post-genocide world. Still, 70 years later, paradoxically, perhaps, ever more so as the genocide recedes in time. Now, these identity-building uses of the past are so familiar now as to be nearly self-evident. But each of them has its own history, so when I think about what our network might achieve, I think in terms of antidotes to taking things for granted. Now, one of these is to be attentive to the ways in which past experience, present needs, and future trajectories emerge dialectically through concrete interactions in historical time. This calls for critical analysis of specific conjunctures in the post-war trajectory of Europe's Roma. So I've already mentioned the immediate post-war situation in which Roma formed part of a much larger population of refugees and displaced persons. I think that moment makes an illuminating point of comparison with today's apparent failure to operate a concerted refugee policy, as well as possibly offering some perspective about how we might recognize success or failure in current policy responses to migration over the long term, and I'm thinking here of Elena's introductory talk. Another point of comparison for the moment of 1945 is, of course, other survivor groups and what we know about the way in which they engaged in self-remaking and the way in which emigration offered itself as a choice, and the relevance of those possibilities to Roma also could fruitfully be explored. A second set of key conjunctures is provided by the process of submitting claims for compensation, which has followed different rhythms in different parts of Europe. For the individual Roma, this process often proceeded in parallel with a formal search for lost family members, as documented in the records of the International Tracing Service in Bad Arolsen, and it might have followed an effort to reclaim confiscated goods and property directly. We know that these interactions were commonly frustrating in the extreme, leaving the long-term memory of a second Holocaust, as German Sinti often referred to that process. And they also challenged Roma to develop new skills and new support networks. They're also closely linked with interrupted histories of material culture, of interactions between people and valued objects. Not least among those is family photographs, which is a key theme in my own research and the focus of an exhibition that I'm developing that will fit into the public engagement program of the project. A third moment is the establishment, consolidation, and disintegration of socialism. So maybe third, fourth, and fifth moment. A system which offered its own variety of scripts about the past and the future. Reflecting on the presentation from Henriette's team yesterday, I caught myself wondering whether the voice of a genocidal past might indeed have simply been drowned out by the roar of radical reconstruction, industrialization, collectivization, and so on. But the very different rhythms of integration and exclusion that we observe, that you've reported on in different countries and even different localities, both under socialism and in post-socialist Eastern Europe, suggest that it's worthwhile exploring further the particular relationships between life in socialism and the lived experience or memory of genocide. A second antidote to taking things for granted is what Yaron somewhat ruefully, or possibly ironically, referred to yesterday as the co-production of knowledge. The involvement of Roma activists, scholars, and community members in the project. Together with Ramona Constantin and other members of Roma Voices, we aim to build on the interview and focus group work they developed in the context of Migrom, and we hope to do similar work in the Czech Republic, working through colleagues at the Charles University in Prague and the Museum of Roma Culture in Brno. For our part, we hope this will help us to develop our capacity to listen carefully to what we hear about what memories are meaningful to whom. Roma themselves are not only the most eloquent promoters of politically functional narratives, but often effective debunkers. When I asked Mirella Steele yesterday from Roma Voices whether any of the Migrom participants had mentioned the genocide in life history interviews, she told me about someone who thought their grandfather had picked up his blue eyes from encounters with Ukrainians in Transnistria. Similarly, in the early 2000s, Krista Hegberg found Slovak Roma who could narrate their persecution and sing a song whose theme was the gypsy experience in Auschwitz. But they didn't recognize the term Holocaust, let alone Poraimos. And in the post-war generations, the Auschwitz reference in the song, which they still sang, wasn't recognized at all. Like ethnographers, historians know that silences are meaningful too, and sometimes they're actually quite noisy if you listen closely. It's also the case that silence about trauma can be read equally as evidence of damage and as a refusal to accept the status of passive victim. We've been, in devising our project, we've been repeatedly reminded of the danger of reducing Roma to victims, and we rely on them to fight back if we do so. Thank you.